Hi guys, welcome to this lecture looking at the second aspect of the symbolic interactionist view of crime and deviance, whereas my lecture before really focused on the process of labelling and leading to things like deviancy amplification and moral panics. This one is looking very much at the social construction of crime and in particular crime statistics. So there's a really useful diagram there on this slide. It's sort of identifying how it is that certain groups, certain individuals end up moving more quickly through each stage of the criminal justice system. So if we argue that, for example, we know that the working class are more likely to move through the criminal justice system more quickly, which means they're more likely to end up with much higher sanctions, and also certain ethnic minority groups, particularly the black community, tend to suffer this type of discrimination within the criminal justice system. For example, the starting point there is legislation regarding social harms. Certain behaviours are not considered a crime, so they're probably behaviours associated more commonly with the middle classes, for example. Other behaviours, which is highlighted in grey, legislated as criminal activity. A good example of that might be antisocial behaviour orders for example, young people perhaps hanging out on the streets in large groups, or loitering. That sort of behaviour has become criminalised more recently, and that sort of behaviour is obviously more associated with perhaps the working classes who have less private spaces to go to in order to kind of hang out and socialise. Anyway, so that behaviour becomes legislated as a criminal activity, so it is seen as a criminal act. If the middle classes are doing it, or perhaps white middle classes are doing it, then maybe that behaviour is not reported to the police. However, if those groups that are considered more deviant by society do see the actions, they will report it to the police, which is what we found in Chambliss's study, for example, when we looked at the roughnecks. They were far more likely to be reported to the police, more likely to be investigated by the police. That then can lead to police arrests, and then it's up to the police whether they arrest individuals or not. The argument is, from symbolic interactionists, they're far more likely to arrest and book particularly young black men, young working class people. And then there's a decision for the prosecutor. This is when you start to kind of engage with the courts. Do you file charges or do you drop charges? Again, young black people, young men, young working class people, far more likely to be charged, far more likely to go to court. When they go to court, there is a racial difference and a class difference as to whether you're more likely to be found guilty or not. And then there's decision as to whether you go to prison or not. And again, there is a difference. Working class more likely to end up in jail, the black community more likely to end up in jail. And what this does is it sort of funnels certain communities, like I said, much more quickly through the criminal justice system to much more serious types of sanctions. At the very bottom of this diagram I find very useful because I think this links very much back to, if you like, the impact of ending up with a criminal record. It says once you leave prison, there's a re-entry into society, and perhaps some groups may be able to re-enter society. However, the majority, particularly again from those communities we've already discussed, they are likely to maybe go back into society. They got the master label or master status of criminal, and that means that they're going to find it much more difficult to perhaps find jobs. Their families, their peer group might not spend time with them. They're more likely to end up in deviant subcultures, and then you get the process of deviancy amplification taking place, whereby they might have to commit crime to survive or for status within the group. That leads to parole violations, and they end back up in jail again, which is similar to Becker's deviant career. So that is the overall process, and all of that feeds into, if you like, official crime statistics, because if they're being charged, if they're being found guilty, then that's going to show up in crime statistics. It's going to reaffirm the view of society, but also more importantly, the agents of social control, that black people are more likely to be criminal. Yep, the working class are more likely to be criminal, so we need to kind of divert our resources in those directions. So, just a reminder about labelling. I want you to add this to your notes. Who is more likely to be labelled as a deviant/criminal. I've just discussed that on the previous slide. So what social groups in society, think about age, think about gender, think about class, think about ethnicity, are more likely to be labelled as deviant or criminal. And thinking back to Becker particularly, what does it depend on? Okay, what does it depend on whether something is considered deviant or whether an individual is considered deviant? And there's sort of three aspects to this. The first one is interactions with agents of social control. It's not going to be labelled as deviant or criminal unless the police sort of pick it up, unless the police do something about it, unless they get involved, and unless the courts perhaps convict someone as guilty. Secondly, there's sort of the appearance, background, personal biography, the who. Okay, so again, that's about the age, the gender, the class, the ethnicity, those ideas of the people who have done it. And there's the argument that perhaps if, I don't know, a middle class lady was perhaps committing some of these deviant acts or criminal acts, are they less likely to be considered the deviant/criminal? Are they less likely to be reported? Well, yes, they are. So as a result, they never have that interaction with the police and they never get labelled as deviant or criminal. And the final one is situation and circumstances of the offence. Like, where does it take place and when does it take place? And I always think a good example of that is perhaps looking at the behaviour between football games and rugby games of fans. So there, in both instances, both social groups tend to drink excessively, and there tends to be like low-level deviance in both among football fans and rugby fans, linked to maybe excessive drinking of alcohol. However, what we tend to find is that the football fans are much more likely to be policed more heavily, criminalised, and dealt with a conflict style of policing, where rugby fans, which tend to be seen as much more middle class, the police tend to laugh it off as just high spirits, rather than seeing it as a criminal deviant act and doing something about it in terms of arresting. So labelling theorists are really interested in how law is applied, particularly to certain groups, and how it is enforced and the impact of that. So that links to things like deviancy amplification and moral panics. And as we found, studies clearly show that the agencies of social control are far more likely to label certain groups as deviant and criminal. And you've got the study from Chambliss, the Saints and the Roughnecks, and the study he did with the RDU in Washington, Jock Young, drug-taking hippies research of deviance amplification, Becker's study on the outsiders and how someone ends up with a master status and a deviant career. And what we're going to be looking at in today's lecture is the ideas of Sickerell about how this process of labelling can really lead to the social construction of crime statistics and how that ultimately has a negative impact on policing overall. So the negotiation of justice is Aaron Sickerell's idea, his concept, his study. And he found that police officers held common sense theories or stereotypes about typical delinquents. So they had in their mind, if you like, preconceived ideas about who was typically delinquent. And as a result, they would concentrate their policing on these particular types. So they might stop and search them more often, ask them more questions, challenge their behaviour. And he said that this led to a really clear class bias, where working class areas were patrolled far more intensively, and as a result there were more arrests, which will therefore confirm stereotypes. So the police might talk to, stop and search more working class people. They're more likely to therefore detect if they're carrying weapons, carrying drugs, underage drinking, for example. It doesn't mean that the middle classes aren't doing these things. It just means that the middle classes aren't getting stopped by the police, so they never end up with that criminal record, that criminal label. And the police don't see the middle class deviants because they're not stopping the middle classes to check if they are committing any crimes. But because they do it in working class areas, it confirms the police stereotypes, which means they're going to have a reinforced common sense idea about typical delinquents being working class. Sickerell, he argued that other agents of social control within the criminal justice system reinforce this bias. So it's not just the police. And he found that probation officers, who are key in deciding what types of sentences people get once they've been convicted, were far less likely to support non-custodial sentences for juvenile delinquents if they were from broken homes, difficult family lives, or living in poverty. So that is a clear class bias in terms of sentencing. It means that juvenile delinquents, so young rule breakers, law breakers, far more likely to end up with custodial sentences, and what that means going into jail, than those that perhaps didn't come from those types of backgrounds. The key point here, guys, is justice is not fixed, justice is not objective, and that whole idea of justice is blind, that is not true. Ciccarel argued justice is clearly negotiable. It's a negotiation between the offenders, the judges, the police officers, and all the different agents involved in the criminal justice system. A really excellent example of this negotiation in place that demonstrates particularly the power of class and your cultural capital to perhaps get you out of trouble is the case of Lavinia Woodward. And I would really like you to read this article. It's not that long. It's in the Independent. So if you just Google Lavinia Woodward, maybe Oxford student and Independent, you should find this. She was an Oxford student and she was spared jail time after she stabbed her boyfriend, I think, in the leg, and I think she might have thrown a computer at his head. And the judge said that she was very bright and she had potential and believed that she may be able to return to her studies because of this potential, despite the fact that she stabbed her boyfriend in the leg, and I think she was on drugs at the time as well. So many levels of law breaking, and yet she was not sent to jail for her behaviour. Clear evidence of a class bias in the system. So do look that up, and can you please add that example into your notes? So thinking about these official crime statistics, Ciccarel argued that all of this, the labelling, the class bias, has real implications for how official crime statistics are used. And he said, look, the crime statistics do not paint a valid picture of the patterns of crime, okay? And this is really important. He said they are not valid, they are not true, and that's because they are basically the reflection of biased policing and stereotypes within the criminal justice system about who is more criminal than others. They do not reflect an objective reality about who is committing crimes. And therefore, they cannot be used as a resource or a fact about crime. So when we look at crime statistics, they tell us that the working class commit more crime. They tell us that black men are more likely to be criminal. And Ciccarel would argue, nope, that is not a fact. That is just a reflection of a social process that has led to those people being targeted more often by the criminal justice system in an unfair way. He did say that sociologists should still use those statistics, and they shouldn't be taken as face value as true, but we should be investigating them as sociologists. We should be looking at these statistics as a starting point for investigation. But he would argue that in terms of, we wouldn't look at them as an objective reality, but what could we actually learn from these statistics? Okay, how can they are useful because they can tell us about how perhaps biased or racist policing exists in our society. Really be useful. And he would argue, so just to kind of go back to a little bit of theory here, remember we were looking at the symbolic interactionist view of crime and deviance. So interactionists, which Ciccarel is one of, he sees official crime statistics as being socially constructed. Interactionists see crime statistics as being socially constructed. At every single level of the criminal justice system, agents of social control make decisions about whether to proceed to the next stage. So thinking about that diagram that we started looking at the very beginning of the lecture, that cone, every single stage, you see that certain groups end up escaping justice and being let off, whereas other groups are far more likely to progress to the next, much more serious stage. The outcome, therefore, depends on the labels that are attached to the individuals that are suspects when they interact with them. So this is agents of social control. Therefore, the statistics can only tell us about the activities of the police and the prosecutors rather than the actual amount of crime and who commits it. And the difference between these official statistics on crime and the real rate of crime is something called the dark figure of crime. So the actual true level of crime, which is much, much higher than the official crime statistics are telling us, and are perhaps being committed by social groups that we don't typically view as being criminal. So there are some concepts here that should be familiar to you. Folk devils here, and crimes of the powerful. So if you like, we're going to say folk devils versus the dark figure of crime. So just to remind you, folk devils, from, if you like, Stan Cohen's Folk Devils and Moral Panics that we've looked at in previous lectures, they can be considered the complete opposite of the dark figure of crime. So those who are committing crime from the dark figure, they are unlabeled. These are groups that are not being targeted by the police. They're not showing up in crime statistics. They don't suffer the master status of being criminal. These crimes are unrecorded because the police aren't investigating them. People don't realise that they're happening, and generally these sorts of crimes are ignored. Whereas folk devils are over-labelled by the media, by the police, by the public. They're more likely to be reported, they're more likely to be criminalised, and they are overexposed to policing. Now, we do need to be worried about this because the consequence of the police pursuing folk devils and focusing very much on that level of criminality means that resources are drawn away from the dark figure, and symbolic interactionists are quite interested in, well, who does this benefit? Effectively, it benefits those who perhaps are the powerful committing crimes, so crimes of the powerful. And that links back to Frank Pierce's ideas about the crimes of the powerful. The police are far more able and likely to investigate street crime that is highly visible and focus on folk devils, and less likely to investigate white-collar crime, corporate environmental crime, for example, that we know can be far more harmful to society. Okay, and that doesn't seem to be changing because the public, the media, and the police seem to be far more focused on, if you like, the folk devils. So just to make a connection here between labelling theory and deviant social construction back to the studies we looked at when investigating suicide, and particularly mental illness. So I want to talk to you briefly here about the interactionists and their sort of approach to their research methods. So if you remember, interactionists reject the approach taken by positivists who rely on official statistics. Okay. And they said, instead, to understand suicide, we actually need to study the meaning for those who take their own lives. So interactionists would argue that suicide statistics are socially constructed, okay? And remember, they were quite critical of Durkheim's study because he relied entirely on official statistics on suicide to draw his conclusions about the causes of suicide using huge amounts of data to identify patterns. So interactionists then would favour interpretivist research methods. So remember, interactionism is a theoretical perspective. Interpretivism is the theory of what is true, okay? And they have a very different view on how we can really find out the truth about suicide. So if you remember Douglas, he's an interactionist, and he said official statistics are socially constructed. They are the outcome of a process with the coroners who construct them rather than the real rate of suicide in society. So he argued that the coroner's decision is the outcome of a negotiation between the coroner, family, friends and doctors and so on. They're not a reflection of an objective reality of exactly the level of suicide. And the example I've done here, so for example in Southern Ireland traditionally has always had a much lower suicide rate arguably than Protestant England. And remember, one of Durkheim's assumptions was Protestants committed suicide more often than Catholics. But according to Douglas, a coroner will interview and interact with doctors and family members that might represent the deceased or talk on behalf of the deceased. Now, if you're a family, okay, who either feel guilty that your family member has passed away or you come from a Catholic country, you do not want your loved one to be ruled as a suicide, because Catholics do not believe that those who commit suicide can be buried in hallowed ground. okay, and that would cause quite a lot of pain and possibly shame on the family themselves. So they would probably do their utmost in court to try and prove that it was death by misadventure, rather than a suicide, because they believe suicide is a sin. Now, if you have those individuals in a coroner's court arguing on behalf of the deceased, then the coroner is more likely to be influenced by them, which essentially means that the coroner's judgment is not of the objective reality of whether it's a suicide or not. It's more a negotiation between the coroner and the family members. Atkinson, I don't know if we've looked at yet, but he effectively said that official statistics are merely labels that coroners attach to death, and it's impossible to know the meanings that the dead give to their death because they've obviously passed away. And he talks about this idea of coroners labelling suicides based on symbols, and they look at, if you like, typicalities or typifications in order to categorise something as a suicide or not. So things like mode of death, like how did they do it, shot to the head versus an overdose, location, circumstances of the individual, and the life history of that person. So for example, he pointed out that more often than not, coroners who have a person who's got mental health issues, who seems to have died in suspicious circumstances, if mental health is a factor, they're far more likely to rule that as a suicide than perhaps someone who was not mentally ill. Likewise, if someone's got a family, the coroner is less likely to rule it as a suicide than someone who doesn't have a family. But Atkinson argued, look, again, you can't be sure that that's not a suicide or it is a suicide, because you can't ask the individual. All that is a reflection of the coroner's decision-making process based on these stereotypes and symbols. And Atkinson actually argued it's impossible to investigate the true cause of suicide. All we can do is measure and examine how coroners socially construct suicide verdicts. The last study I just want to mention to you really briefly is Rosenhan's study of labelling of mentally ill patients. Okay, so I think it's called Being Sane in Insane Places. So he himself and his students pretended to have symptoms of schizophrenia. I think they said that they heard a voice or saying thump, thump, or thud, thud when they went to doctors. The doctors then admitted them to mental health institutions or asylums, and once they were inside these sort of mental health institutions, every single one of the students, including Rosenhan, stopped mimicking the symptoms of schizophrenia and behaved completely normally. Regardless of that, they couldn't get rid of their master status, if you like, of having schizophrenia, even when they spoke to nurses and doctors and psychiatrists and saying they felt completely normal. The medical experts saw all of that behaviour as evidence of them being mentally ill, of them when they denied that they were mentally ill, that was seen as a symptom of their mental illness. And I think Rosenhan himself, who spent his time when he was incarcerated, if you like, he spent a lot of his time writing notes because he was doing research. Him writing notes was seen as evidence of obsessive mental health issues. And that just demonstrates, again, the power of a negative master status, particularly, like we said, we talked about crime so far, but this is about mental illness, which, if you like, is an aspect of deviant behaviour. So this is clear evidence that mental illness in itself is a social construction. It's not an objective medical fact, because these experts who've had years and years of training, for example, they couldn't recognise that they had sane people in front of them, purely because the medical experts were so heavily influenced by this master label of that these people had by being admitted into their institutions for schizophrenia. The experts couldn't see past the power of that master status to recognise that these individuals were perfectly sane. So that's another aspect of the social construction of mental health statistics. Thanks for listening, guys. Bye.